Welcome to the conference session on Eurasia's place in the future of raw materials value chains. A timely and critical discussion given the escalating global demand for critical raw materials driven by the decarbonization of economies and the digital transition. The year 2024 has witnessed remarkable growth in foreign direct investment and trade within the Eurasian mining sector. Western nations, including the UK, Europe and the USA, are actively forging partnerships with Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Mongolia and other Central Asian nations to secure vital supply chains for critical raw materials. However, this pursuit is not without challenges, as these Western countries face mounting competition from Chinese, Arab, Turkish and Russian-backed enterprises. The stakes in this arena are high. The demand for rare earth metals is projected to increase six-fold by 2030, while the demand for lithium is expected to surge 12-fold in the same period. Today, Europe relies heavily on imports, often from a single third country, and recent crises have underlined EU strategic dependencies. Without joint and timely action, a well-functioning single market, resiliency and competitiveness, European industries and efforts to meet its climate and digital objectives are at risk. These staggering figures underscore the urgency of our discussions today. As we delve into this topic, we'll explore several key questions. How will the increasing competition for Eurasian resources shape the future of global raw materials value chains? Can Eurasian governments, particularly those of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Mongolia, maintain a balanced approach to deal allocation? What strategies can ensure the stability and security of raw material supply chains, especially for Western nations? Our esteemed presenters will aim to provide insights into these critical issues, examining the geopolitical implications, economic opportunities, and potential challenges that lie ahead.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Monday morning. Obviously, Monday is starting off in a slightly dodgy way, but hopefully we will get you all back on track. As for those of you who are fresh to our train system, Mondays, it's never the right time to travel to try to be somewhere on time because railway engineering tends to overrun or other aspects. But fortunately, for those people who are here, we are able to have a wonderful panel of speakers. And I will kick it off immediately with Pauline.
Thank you very much, moderator. Thank you to the organizers for inviting the OECD in this important discussion. So I will be presenting the OECD's perspective on opportunities and challenges for developing critical mineral sectors in Eurasia. And coming from the OECD, I will take a particular stance on public policy intervention, the need for it, rationale for this intervention, and how it can support governments in the region in particular to develop those critical mineral sector. So first of all, why public policy intervention is needed as we're considering the critical mineral development in Eurasia. It's the development imperative that goes with the development of critical minerals. Achieving resilient critical mineral supply will require expanding mining in regions like Eurasia, but also Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, all regions that the OECD works with. And this certainly presents economic opportunities, but also risks of environmental damage, human rights issues, economic dependency and potential conflict. There's also risk of resource nationalism, trade restrictions, which could slow the green transition. And as you certainly have in mind, developing the sector as space will be challenging, as the IEA estimates that under current policies aligned with climate objectives, the need for critical minerals will double until 2030. So that's in more or less 5 years, and quadruple to 2050 under a global net zero scenario. So there's a real need to develop the sector at pace while ensuring these economic and social benefits and mitigating the risks I just mentioned. And so in this perspective, partnerships between importers and exporters can drive the green transition through shared benefits and harm mitigation. And the objective of international cooperation and supporting sound public policy will be to help producer countries make the most of their natural resources and achieve sustainable development. So now focusing specifically on the Eurasia region, what are those opportunities and risks we're talking about? And here I will be talking from the experience of the OECD, which has been working for about 25 years with countries of Eastern Partnership and Central Asia on competitiveness, economic diversification, sustainable development, as well as environmental and green growth policies, including through the program that I am responsible for in Central Asia on sustainable infrastructure. So in terms of opportunities, I'm sure most people in this room know about this, but Eurasia countries have very rich subsoils, and in addition, they hold great experience already in mining activities, which are also sectors that have high shares that have been drivers of economic growth in the region. And critical mineral development can support sustainable growth through economic diversification, a long-standing objectives of governments in the region, help create new jobs and enable a just transition at a time where the region is looking to move away from fossil fuels, which is a threat to a number of regions. And it can lead in the higher integration of regions into sustainable global value chains. And in this regard, the current connectivity agenda, including the development of the Trans-Caspian corridor, provides a backbone to the development of critical mineral value chains, as well as the strategic partnerships with potential trade partners that were mentioned in the video we watched. On the other hand, Eurasia countries are facing a number of risks. Some are inherent to the mining sector and others are more specific to their economies. One is highly capital-intensive sector, long lead times and cyclical prices, which are characteristic of the mining sector. All risks, or some of them, that may be further exacerbated by the specific characteristics of the energy transition, including technological breakthrough, mineral substitution, and improved recycling rates. Another risk is, of course, mitigating and managing environmental and social impacts. In Eurasia and economic developing and transitioning economies in particular, there's a country risk and higher cost of capital, which sometimes needs to be addressed, as well as a number of misalignments in national policy frameworks that can act as barriers to investment. And so those are key policy areas for attracting financing in critical minerals and aligning on sustainable practices. The OECD has been working with governments of the region in these three areas. First, core policy frameworks for attracting investments. There's been significant progress in that area in the past 20 years. This means stability and predictability of the regulatory framework, consistent and transparent implementation of policies, and sound mechanisms for dispute resolution. A second area is a sector-specific policy and regulatory framework. A number of initiatives are developing in the region for geological surveys and enhanced data, which is very welcome. It also requires careful assessment of environmental payments, taxes, penalties, and other tax incentives and disincentives that need to be addressed in policy frameworks, as well as ensuring the right level of competition in the different mining sector segments. And a third key area will be developing the best practices for mitigating environmental and social impacts, including with regards to national direct contribution and net zero targets and how mining sectors should contribute in achieving those targets, managing water risks and impacts, which are critical in the region, protecting biodiversity and promoting nature-based solutions where they can be more economically efficient, and promoting the collocation of infrastructure and circularity of the economy at the local level. Across those three policy areas, there's a number of horizontal and enabling conditions that need to be put in place or reinforced, which is cooperation across levels of government, the national and subnational levels, sound sector governance, adoption of internationally recognized approaches, as well as the right level of skills. And so to conclude, I wanted to highlight the OECD's work on critical minerals. We have in our organization a number of key policy areas where we have great expertise, and by mobilizing these different expertise in those different policy areas, the OECD is fostering a horizontal whole of OECD approach that mirrors a need for a whole of government approach to the sound development of critical minerals. Those policy areas are responsible business conduct, environmental sustainability, economic development, regional and local development, international trade, development assistance, and tax policy. And so by through the accumulation of a large body of knowledge and experience across those policy fields, as well as the development of leading standards, we're in a position to support, to continue supporting and reinforcing our cooperation with Eurasia countries on the important topic of critical minerals. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Pauline. Any questions for Pauline? We've got time for about one question. Otherwise, save them up for the coffee break and grab the people in. So I'd like to now move on to Henry Sanderson, Executive Editor of Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. Please.
Thank you very much for having me here at this conference. I'm going to just talk a bit about the future of the raw material supply chains that others who know more about Eurasia can talk about their role in, but I'm going to give an overview of where we are and where I think we're going. We're at a very interesting time at the moment. Just a quick sort of history lesson. Clean energy is not new, and we've actually been trying for over 100 years to get to where we are today. This is Thomas Edison. We know him for the light bulb. He actually worked on batteries over 100 years ago. This is Henry Ford. This is an early version of the electric vehicle that his wife drove, was very popular at the time. And Edison and Ford worked on electric vehicles and batteries over 100 years ago. It also got remarkably close. If you look at these numbers, number of models, number of producers, and real prices. So this technology has been around for a long time. This idea has been around for a long time. But we're in many ways still in a very fossil fuel dominated world. If you look at global energy, 80% of energy still comes from fossil fuels. So we're still at the really beginning stages of an energy transition. Electric vehicles today are about 2% of the total stock of vehicles worldwide. And so you can see, even though it's a 100-year-old story, it's really a 10-year success story if you look at sales. So it hasn't really been going for that long. And if you look at clean energy, it's also very much a China story. This is solar installations last year. You can see without China, it's very much a reduced amount. China installed more solar than the rest of the world combined last year. So I'll just talk briefly about, number one, the state of battery demand. China's dominance in these supply chains, I think that's key also for Eurasia to think about. Where I work now, Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, how do we view these markets? And then how to build ex-China supply chains. This is one of the really fundamental questions at the moment. Can we do it? How long is it going to take to do it? And what's the role of government in that? So first of all, where are we now? So sales this year, overall, they're doing well, even though you read the negative stories in the media. But if you look at the dark color on that graph, China's really propping up the entire market this year. About 8 million sales of electric vehicles in China compared to 13 million worldwide. So outside of China, the picture is really not very rosy this year, and that has huge knock-on impacts on the whole supply chain. So if you look at battery demand, what we're forecasting for the growth this year, you can see again, China, we forecast to account for the lion's share of growth. And within China, so I said China's had very successful EV sales this year. We've seen a huge rise in plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. You can see on the yellow line, that's China plug-in hybrid electric vehicle sales. They've grown by over 80% this year. So while China's EV sales have rocketed ahead, the share of plug-in hybrids has really increased. And as part of that trend, we're seeing these range extended EVs in China. So these are vehicles where you have very small internal combustion engines that just help extend the range, but you have bigger batteries. And that's kind of interesting because if you look at the average battery size for electric vehicles, you can see that these range extender vehicles have bigger batteries than plug-in hybrid vehicles. So that's actually more positive for battery demand, for raw material, mineral demand. So it's not the shift to plug-in hybrid vehicles is not as negative as we would first think. The other market that's really accelerating this year is energy storage. And people in the industry say this could be bigger than the EV market eventually. So again, that's another really big growth market that is accelerating. And even in the US markets like California, Texas, we've seen huge growth in energy storage. And we're seeing that the combination of batteries and solar and wind can really help sort of shift the peak in demand to later in the day and really help the grids in those states cope. And the main trend also is battery costs have fallen sharply this year, and this is because raw material prices have come down significantly, but also because China has scaled battery manufacturing, has come up with improvements in how to make batteries. So that's really going to help drive new adoption, especially in energy storage. Because if you think about energy storage, you really need batteries to be cheap as possible. You don't want to be spending a lot on batteries. So longer term, as I said before at the beginning, we're really at the beginning stages of this energy transition. I mean, if you look at the data, some people would say we're not even in a transition, we're just in an energy addition. But longer term, we have to make the transition. And eventually we could see around 300 terawatt hours, 20 terawatt hours batteries produced a year. So the raw material implications are really significant. 12 million tons of lithium. We produce about 1 million tons of lithium at the moment. We may have to get to 3 million by the end of this decade. So longer term, it is a very optimistic scenario, but I don't think the path to get there will be a smooth one. Just to talk about the different stages of the supply chain, I think this is really key because if you think about Eurasia focusing on the extraction or the mining side, where do you sell your materials to? It's very well the West or other people talking about de-risking from China, but where are you actually going to sell your raw materials to? And at the moment, China is very dominant in the processing, cathode and anode production. And so even though the US is building lots of battery factories, it hasn't got the rest of the supply chain. So you end up having these supply chains that go via China or via Chinese companies in other places. So just, I'll just talk a bit about that point, which is if you look at cathode, anode, China is incredibly dominant. And these are probably the worst industries for the West to try and build out. They're low margin, they're highly competitive. So it's very difficult for us to compete. If you look at, as I say, the chemical production on the right, you see in something like graphite, China's almost 100% of production. HPMSM, that's high purity manganese. Again, China's very dominant. And in all the chemicals, China's extremely dominant. So this means, even if we open some new mines or mining happens in Eurasia, who are you actually going to sell to at the moment? Often it's China. Just talk a bit about how the West can catch up then. I think many of you read about Northvolt, which was this Swedish battery company that's just gone bankrupt. I think Europe, especially Europe, US too, we do have to try and not to do everything at once, one bit at a time. If you look at something like Northvolt, they wanted to do cathode, they wanted to do recycling, they wanted to do everything. I think that's slightly too ambitious. The second point is companies with diverse businesses can weather commodity price downturns. And we're actually seeing big companies come into this sector now, like Exxon Mobil going into lithium, Rio Tinto acquiring a lithium company. That's probably what we need to compete with China, so that if commodity prices crash, you don't give up and go out of business. You can actually weather these cycles. Using renewable energy, obviously that's a huge advantage. China's grid is still 60% coal, and especially areas like graphite production, they're mostly based on fossil fuels. Government subsidies and tariffs. We've seen this huge wave of enthusiasm for industrial policy in Europe and the US, and I do think that plays a key role, and especially on the demand side. As I said at the beginning, at the moment, electric vehicle sales are very weak in Europe and not so strong in the US. So while we think about subsidizing supply, manufacturing, we also need to not forget about demand. We're not quite there where electric vehicles are cheap enough to sustain their own momentum. And then now what Europe's looking at is working with China. Can we license their technology? Can we do joint ventures? This is going on even in the US. So that's probably a clever strategy. So I think when Eurasia thinks about its role in these supply chains, I think at the moment it's very much a China-dominated supply chain, and we're seeing setbacks in Europe. And in the US, we have Trump coming in. And the interesting thing about Trump is he wants to generate US jobs and US investment, which is good for building these ex-China supply chains, but he's not so strong on the demand side, which is consumer subsidies for electric vehicles. And my worry is, unless Europe and the US now stimulate demand, we are not going to be able to build these ex-China supply chains. And as I say, for Eurasia, for mineral-rich countries, that is a bit of a setback, and we need to see that happening so that we can create these supply chains that diversify the clean energy economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. I mean, a quick question before you disappear from the speakers. It's just I see a lot of change in technologies happening, sodium batteries and moving to much higher energy efficiency batteries and things like that. I mean, how does that change any of your projections?
Yes, I mean, the interesting thing is that the pace of innovation in China is huge at the moment. And I think we in the West haven't quite realized that BYD has 20,000 people in R&D, CATL has similar amounts. So these are huge companies that are really pursuing innovation in a very aggressive way. And these Chinese battery companies, BYD, CATL, they have 30-year history in this business. So they know everything there is to know about batteries. So the combination of that with innovation is really powerful. So we're seeing not only improvements to the current technology, but new technologies such as sodium ion, which promise to be potentially cheaper, safer. You can ship them more easily. And so for something like energy storage, that's ideal. But even electric vehicles, we're seeing companies put sodium ion batteries with lithium ion in the same vehicle, so diversify the chemistry. So there's all sorts of things happening, and we don't quite know how fast it's going to happen and where we're going to go next. But eventually we will get to solid state batteries where you replace the liquid electrolyte with a solid material. You increase the energy density by using silicon graphite or lithium metal on the anode, and that's really potential game changer for range, for providing range in electric vehicles. But saying all that, the biggest challenge outside of China for Europe and the US is getting the cost down of electric vehicles. And in the EU, the average price is still 40,000 euros. So until we get that cost down, then we can't have that mass market adoption, which is what we need. So that's, instead of innovating totally new chemistries, that's probably what we need in the near term. And then those other chemistries will come through. But I'm very worried about to where Europe is. Electric vehicle sales have fallen this year, and we see yesterday, the CEO of Stellantis stepping down. European automakers are in real problems because the Chinese market, which is a big market, they're losing market share, and then European EV sales are falling. So it's a really tricky situation. So we need to get the cost down and stimulate consumer demand. And I think governments need to help stimulate the demand side. Otherwise, we're just not going to get there.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
Yeah, my question is when energy is the most expensive for businesses in the world, in the UK and Europe, compared even with the US, how are we able to even entertain manufacturing and increasing the cost of electric vehicles when we're so handicapped in this position?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a huge problem. It's like 4 times the cost of the US. The energy cost is a huge issue. And I visited a lithium refinery in Germany that had just opened up. And the owner said, Germany moving beyond nuclear was the worst ever decision made by a leader in peacetime. But you're right. You're already in a situation where the margins in China are low and the companies in China are struggling to make money. The idea that we can come along, build a new plant, compete with that kind of energy cost is just unrealistic. So I think you're right. We absolutely need to see energy costs come lower, because Europe, if you look at it, we're in not a good situation because the US energy costs are low and Trump's vowing to drill more energy. And then you've got China on the other hand. So yeah, unless we get energy costs down, almost all of this supply chain that I talked about is very energy intense. Like battery gigafactories use huge amounts of energy, and the processing, everything else is very energy intense. So I think that's absolutely right. There's a fundamental problem. But beyond that, if you look at something like Northvolt, they went to the north of Sweden because they had hydroelectric power that was cheaper. But still, that wasn't enough, right? You still need the technical know-how, everything else. And at the end of the day, also depends on the customer. Are they willing to pay more for European a supply chain? Not at the moment, but maybe in the future.
I've got a question up there. That would be the last one.
Right.
So how do you see collaboration with China taking place in practice when we have Trump who's threatening to put tariff? Even Europe it's all about decoupling from China. So how do you see that going forward in practice? You think it's
Yeah, I think it's going to happen, and it's already happening. I don't know if you want to repeat your question?
How do you see collaborating with China taking place in practice when there's all of this foreign policy rhetoric about decoupling from China, and we have Trump who's adding tariffs and so forth? So how do you see that relationship going forward?
Yeah, so I think it's happening, and it is going to happen. I think we may see examples where the Chinese ownership is hidden or the technology is just licensed. But I think in Europe now, after Northvolt, there's a fundamental realization that we need the Chinese know-how, the Chinese experience. So, and it's already happening in Europe that Chinese are building in Hungary, Poland, Germany. In the US, obviously, it's more complicated. But as I said, I think Trump cares about jobs, about investment, and I think we could see those deals happen in the US. He's even said that he would be willing to let Chinese EV companies come to the US as long as they invest. But then again, you have seen big backlash in the US against Chinese projects. Like a Chinese company wanted to build a battery plant in Michigan. It's had a huge amount of hostility. So I think, but then not every project goes above the radar. You do see Chinese companies building things in the US, even solar manufacturing, etc. So I think as long as they're investing there and providing jobs, I think it might go ahead. But who knows? I mean, the fundamental issue is the demand side, as I said, especially for electric vehicles. And even also someone like Tesla, which is obviously in favor, they're actually furthest along in terms of building their own supply chain, so making their own batteries, etc. So in a way, they could be big winners because they don't need so much of the Chinese investment. But
all right, Henry, we'll have to wrap it up there.
Yeah, right. Fascinating question.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to invite Dr. Mark Robinson to come and speak, Executive Director of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative.
Morning. It's a pleasure to be with you all, and thank you to the organisers.
Microphone on green.
Good morning. Thank you to the organisers for offering a speaking slot today. So I represent the EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. For those of you who don't know us, we are a global anti-corruption organisation existing in 55 countries to promote investment and to ensure that scarce extractives benefit the citizens of those countries. So what I'm going to talk about today is how member countries in Eurasia, long-standing members, are using the EITI as a vehicle to demonstrate they're serious about mitigating corruption risk and ensuring good governance in the mineral supply chains. We all know the numbers, the huge increase in minerals demand that will be necessary to achieve the targets the first two speakers spoke about. And we've also talked already this morning about these transitions. So I won't say more about this, but clearly there's enormous demand for the minerals from Central Asia, in particular from the 5 countries that make up Central Asia. I'm going to actually be in 3 of those in a week's time, so this is fantastic preparation for me. I'll be in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and then Uzbekistan, which of course also has significant future minerals potential. And in addition to that, Mongolia is also a member. So these are important member countries for us of the EITI. These numbers speak for themselves. And what's interesting here, of course, is these don't necessarily map on directly onto those minerals which are particularly in enormous demand for EVs. But these are many of the minerals required for the renewable energy sector, in particular for solar and wind. And those of you who know that industry will recognize why I'm making that particular point. These are not countries which presently are very rich in lithium or in cobalt or in some of the other elements in enormous demand, including copper, which is quite modest in these countries. So just remember, there's not an immediate read from this to electric vehicles. Some of the elements will be in demand, but there's also huge potential to fuel the renewable energy sector. This detailed chart gives you some feel for the share of transition minerals production that are there for significant countries in the region. But you'll only notice of the list here that Kazakhstan, for example, is probably the most significant one within that group of Eurasian countries. So there are significant variations across the countries in Central Asia in terms of resources and potential demand that will help to benefit them. Another layer down, I spoke about 4 of the 5 countries, Uzbekistan as well, but these figures speak for themselves. So you have Kazakhstan, second largest producer of chromium, vital for wind turbine production. Mongolia, huge gold and copper mines. Kyrgyzstan, again, gold and copper. And then Tajikistan with its zinc, aluminium, and other minerals. So interesting variation across, but they all have significant current dependence. It's a big share of the economy, significant share of exports. It's only going to grow in the future. And you may remember that Kazakhstan is already a major oil and gas producer in addition to having significant critical minerals. Now, resource-rich countries, we know from our experience in the EITI, have enormous potential to generate long-term benefits for their citizens in the form of increased tax revenues to invest in social services, in infrastructure. They have the potential to create jobs and overall boost economic growth. Sadly, that's not always the case. There's many cases of resource-rich countries around the world that have not achieved that potential. So what we're interested in is helping countries that are members of the EITI to achieve what should be that long-term growth trajectory. But there are risks. And those risks are both in terms of corruption risks, as I mentioned earlier. It's only natural that people see a big rent-seeking opportunity here. People who want to make money illegally from the sector for themselves rather than for the benefit of the country and its citizens. That is true around the world, sadly, and it's especially true in this sector. So what we're encouraging is go in with your eyes open, tackle and mitigate what is a significant risk. The other risk is one that we heard about from our speaker from the OECD around environmental impacts. How can EITI reporting support local communities to both be aware of the potential benefits to them in terms of local community investments, in terms of job creation, in terms of infrastructure, and not to see those benefits concentrated purely in the capital cities and in a relatively small share of the population. So I mentioned earlier we have 4 members already in the Central Asian region. The fundamental way we work is we bring together industry, government, and civil society around the table in multi-stakeholder groups. That creates a mechanism to foster public debate and deepen public understanding of this sector. It creates a recognition that this can be a real boost to economic prosperity in the future, so long as transparency and accountability is fundamental to policy which is designed to promote the sector. So all 4 countries currently implement with different degrees of success, but the EITI standard, our reporting mechanism, is something that actually does demonstrate the potential to achieve progress. Some of the important areas in terms of the anti-corruption agenda are a requirement now that all contracts between governments and private companies are put into the public domain. That's incredibly important so that citizens know that they're getting a good deal from the contracts being entered into, so that companies know that they are entering into deals that are reasonably comparable and not subject to under the table mechanisms which would undermine the quality of those contracts. There's also important investments around licensing. Licensing is, of course, so important to the minerals production, right from the very beginning for exploration through to production. And many countries have multiple licenses in the mining sector, but these, again, are subject to corruption risk. Payments to speed up and facilitate licensing from officials who may be tempted by the possibility of gaining money. So this is why this is so important in order to promote what should be a very significant opportunity. Mongolia is a good example where it actually is already progressing with disclosing contracts and identifying the beneficial owners, the real owners of companies to access licenses. Beneficial ownership is important because it helps identify politically exposed persons, officials or politicians who may have a stake in a company and use it to benefit their own interests rather than those of the wider citizenry. Tajikistan, here the emphasis is on strengthening investment climate. Good governance is positive for inflows of investment into the sector, and also to promote public knowledge and debate in an environment that's not always an easy one or a very open one to do that. So this is a way of opening up for public scrutiny, a very important sector for the countries in question. So in terms of the detail around governance risk, this slide brings out in suggests several different layers of why contracts matter so much, why there can be other challenges to the sector, as we've seen and we heard the last speaker talk about, in terms of the challenges of price volatility, which can in turn affect revenue projections. And a lot of resource-rich countries, including those producing critical minerals, are subject to those very fluctuations. I've just come back from the DRC, where, of course, it's the largest producer of cobalt. 70% of the world's cobalt comes from the DRC. Prices have plummeted. They're a quarter of what they were a year ago. That has really fundamental impacts on the public exchequer. So to be wise about price volatility and revenue impacts and to document those revenue impacts and to communicate them to citizens builds trust. I've mentioned our standard. We review this every 3 years and update it. The last one built in, or the current one, energy transition, right at the heart of our reporting framework, given some of the very rapid changes we're seeing in the sector. But what continues to be important is how resource-rich countries can generate revenues to invest in public services and how can we build in mechanisms like contract transparency and beneficial ownership to reduce corruption risk. Another risk area, which the first speaker touched on, is you may not know, but most future mining potential lies on land owned by land-dependent communities, or has the indigenous peoples have rights over its use. Estimates vary, but it could well be over 50% globally. And in the Eurasia region, there are large communities that fall into that category. So there are basic land rights at stake here when it comes to expansion of mining. So respect for and understanding of those rights and creating public debate around them is vitally important to gain the assent of the wider citizenry. So finally, what's the role that we can play? Generating data and dialogue to shed light on how the energy transition is impacting the wider extractive sector, and to support national efforts to strengthen governance in a changing industry to maximize the value of those resources for those countries' citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Got time for about one question. Okay, thank you very much indeed, Mark. I'd like to now invite to the stage Dr. Mike Lewis. All right. Running all the way from Bath, managed all the trains, managed to get here on time. So Mike, Professor of the Operations and Supply Management at the Bath School of Management.
Right, well, good morning.
Morning.
I mean, did he not explain? I've just used UK National Transport. It's a miracle I'm here at all. Actually, it's emblematic of one of the great challenges of what I want to talk about, which is the need to move across different levels of analysis. Right? So in theory, we have a train line that goes from the West Country to London. In theory, we have train lines that go to the north. And aggregate, an economist would look at that as a matrix and say, yes, sufficient capacity. When we move down to the micro level of the individual moving, then those slight disturbances, those micro movements of just being 12 minutes late, just under the refund level, you'll notice. It's almost like they planned that. We'll wait here to 14 minutes and then we'll go in. It's catastrophic potentially. It changes the nature of the value exchange you're trying to complete, and that's kind of the work I do. I'm interested in these problems of multiple levels of analysis as we try and move stuff around the world and do stuff with it. So, I mean, just as a little bit of background, I come from a mining community in South Wales, which tells you my age because there aren't any mining communities in South Wales anymore. And I worked in the steel industry briefly, but essentially I'm an academic. Academic meaning no practical value, of course. So in that sense, my goal for this morning is simple, I think. It's to try and not confuse you more than this is already confusing, and maybe add a little bit of lens work. What I mean by that, you know, when you go to the optician, again, being in my 50s now, I have to go to the optician regularly, and they put those things over your head, those funny shaped obstacles, and they drop the lenses over. And depending on your point of view, the quality of your eyes, the different lenses will either bring it into focus or make it a little bit blurry. Right. So when we start to talk about big words like geopolitics and supply and critical minerals, all I think I can do this morning in my short period is maybe offer a little bit of lensing of that problem with the hope that maybe it'll bring something into sharp focus, or something you think erroneously is clear is maybe a little bit blurrier than it actually is. So that's my goal. So this slide kind of is capturing geopolitics. You know, this is a field of study and a field of practice that probably is 200 years old as a formal discipline, but in essence, it splits broadly into three areas, three lenses, and I want to talk about each of those very briefly on my introductory slide here, if I can. The first, and it's interesting we were talking about standards and regulation, is very much a more contemporary lens on geopolitics, but that's what we might call constructivism. The idea that the stories we tell each other have meaning, right? And I put the EU flag here because it should probably be a little bit more tarnished, maybe with a slight fire in the corner. But the idea of the European Union is a construction amongst people that this is a better way to do things. And that has real meaning when it comes to critical minerals and other extractive industries and industry in general, right? Because it's about Critical Minerals Act of 2023. It's about trying to make sense of things that are happening around the world and saying, look, we can make sense of that with rules. You can follow my compliant rules. You can follow my standards. Even in chaotic states, we still have rules that we can use, and they give us a story to work to. And I'm not undermining that. That's where I come from, it kind of emotionally, but it is stories. And when you see current geopolitics, you see the sense of which when people start to contest those stories or pull them apart, that some of those rules start to be less useful. So geopolitics, yeah, European Union. And if you don't believe it's constructed, come to Britain where we had Brexit. And that's entirely a narrative piece. Then we come to the middle, and this is the heartland really of geopolitics, and that's the sort of realism perspective. And I put Trump here. This is Trump 1.0 or whatever, what he's on now, when he was last president, when he was in Australia trying to do a deal on critical minerals. Interestingly, his truth social tweeting, whatever he calls it, what do you call it? Truthing? I don't know. Recently about putting tariff, if you believe such a thing, into play has perked the interest of many of the Australian mineral producers again, because they think there's a move behind that rail politique to say, look, we can make advantage from that. So realism, resource nationalism is a phrase that we now use profoundly and centrally in our narratives, but it's anchored in this idea of realism. We have something you do not. What do you want to do about it? And then when we come in a moment to talk about rare earths and other things, we'll see that there's definitely state actors who've been using realism in their geopolitics to make sense of the world in a way when other states were using constructivism to make sense of the world. And so you have kind of interesting competitions. Now, that's not to say they're mutually exclusive, right? If I was an academic, I'd have to argue for one discipline or another, one point of view or another, and I get very upset over very small differences. But of course, Trump is realistic enough to understand that the US has limitations. That's why he's freaking out about Saudi issuing of dollar-backed instruments at the moment. But there's some really interesting overlaps between these things. But the lenses for me are useful. Is it a constructivist narrative? Is it a realist narrative? Is it a critical narrative? Those groups of people who seek, in particular using a modern world of technology and storytelling, to bring local stories to the fore to make a critical narrative of what's going on. The protest movements that go viral, they are not really critical. They're not really constructivist. They're not really realist. They're critical narratives. They're storytelling from the floor. They tend to make things like borders and boundaries really important, because those are the places where the friction stories happen. This critical lens where we try and look for alternative explanations for what's going on. Now, that can be rational critical. It can be, yes, the Democratic Republic of Congo is a terrible position because largely of Western countries over 200 years exploiting those resources, that they now turn around and say to China, what are you doing taking those resources? We were taking those resources. That's our job. And leaving a kind of democratic deficit and no infrastructure and all the rest of it, colonialism, if you like, is real. It has a legacy. So some of it is that kind of empirically true stuff. But some of it is, again, Trumpian, the state, the system, the way of working and power, and using that as part of your narrative. So 3 lenses, each of them is a year's lecture, right? So you bear that in mind as I drop through this. But is this a story? Is this about resource realism? Or is this something a little bit more critical going on? And then we have this idea of criticality in itself. I'm not sure what time I'm supposed to be going to, by the way. Do you tell me?
Well, you've got about another minutes.
Okay, well, I got 2 more slides. So I don't know, many of you may have been at the launch of the 2024 Royal Society Criticality Index last week. Gavin Mudd and his team, brilliant work. But even this idea of criticality is problematic, right? Because it takes your point of view so clearly centered. It's not really unambiguous. And even if you look at the index where they draw a beautiful curve and they decide what's on one side of the curve and what's on another, when you dig into that, they've asked people where they think the curve should be. So there's even a construction in the most analytical framing of this conversation. Criticality for who? Why? And the second you give something the designation criticality, that has a market impact, right? And so there's something interesting about the reflection in these systems as well. So how do I make sense of this idea of criticality? I leave the analytical work to my much more esteemed geological colleagues who do this brilliantly. But how can we have a situation where the fifth most abundant element on the planet is critical? How, you know, just why, how do I instantly sense make of that? And it's some of these things are in our matrices and metrics, but I try and extract them as the ABCs, how I tell my students, right, to understand it. It's partly about abundance, how much is there, but it's also a lot about accessibility. Where is it? That's why geopolitics comes to the fore, right? Can I get there? Can I get to it? More on the sea and space, perhaps at the end if we have time. So the idea of abundance and accessibility is critical. So just understanding the amount of it, what's your route to getting hold of it? What's your route to exporting it? What's your route to importing it? Then a really interesting point from my last speaker about the kind of volatility, supply chain 101. Actually, supply chain's a terrible word. Don't use it, right? Because it gives this sense of solidity and existence that doesn't exist. Supply chains aren't like that, especially not in commodity spaces. They're not like connected one-to-one down a lane. They're supply systems, they're complex and messy. Price signals really matter. But we teach in our supply management 101 the bullwhip effect, right? So the bullwhip effect is a classic systems dynamic concept that says if you have a small movement here on information and the system isn't aware of it and amplifies or distorts it, especially if you have delays, think about responding to a demand signal with opening a new mine or opening a new wing or moving a new processing plant, it doesn't happen quickly, right? When you have delay and imperfect information flows, and price signals are good, but they're not perfect information flows, then you get amplification. So you take small demand signals doing this, and they amplify themselves. So what's called the bullwhip. The bullwhip means you whip the whip, and it cracks. And why does it crack? Because that's the speed of sound being broken, right? It seems almost extraordinary to think about that. But that amplification process is what's driving your price volatility. And so it's not just about availability and abundance. It's also about the balance of supply. And it's about the signals that communicate balance of supply. And you will end up with over and under. So DRC is a great example currently of a critical resource that was priced high and is now priced low. This happens in all sorts of industries where you have these global dynamics and you have delays. Think shipping.
I think we need to move on to B now.
That is B. Balance. That is B. Balance of supply. And then C, you've thrown me now. Thank you for that. And then C, contingency. We also have to understand the kind of balance of the proactive efforts that individual actors at different levels are making into those chains. So if you think about, and I'll come to it now in a second, or perhaps I'll come to it now, if one starts to think about the 2010, celebrated 2010, well, let's play it. There we go. One thinks about the celebrated 2020 incident between Japan and China, which ended up in a boycott of rare earths. Let's have a look at this for a second. So this is a Chinese fishing ship. We're being filmed from the Japanese coast. See, they're not. The accusation the Japanese are making is you're in our territorial waters. And now the question is, who will look for? Come back. So I'll stop that. So that's it. You've probably heard of it. It's had tremendous impact on the geopolitics of critical materials. Now, what I love about this video, again, back to my earlier framing of lensing, because you're on the Japanese boat, this definitely looks like the Chinese trawler hit them. But actually, if you look at the track in 3D space, it's not as clear cut as that at all. It looks to be two ships quite close to each other, maybe making slight adjustment errors and then ended up with a coming together. 17 days, the captain ended up in prison. You probably know this is related to a territorial dispute about historical ownership of islands. It's not just China and Japan, it's also PRC as well. So there's a whole host of messiness there, constructed, right? It's constructed. It's a narrative people are telling about themselves, but it really matters. Now, the story goes that because the Japanese arrested the captain and wouldn't release him for a crime they didn't think he committed, the Chinese embargoed rare earths to the Japanese. That's the story. And certainly there was a price response. 4, 5, 10 times in some key rare earths. Rare earths, another example of great branding, by the way, if you're trading in rare earths. Of course, they're not rare at all, but because somebody is just rare, meaning quite unusual when they were first named. Wonderful. So you have this idea of you have price volatility. Yeah, sure. Price volatility that comes from this. But what's the reality of it? What's the reality of it? And this is where I'm going to close, because I love this story and this example. Actually, there probably wasn't an embargo by the Chinese. There were some policy instruments in play already that may have been coming to the fore just at about that time. There certainly was a market reaction. There certainly was a Japanese government reaction. There certainly was a reaction around the world about the percentage of rare earths being extracted, about 95% at that time in China. It's now, after 15 years of effort, down to about 80%. So some movement gives you a sense of the time delays at a systems level of some of this. Also reveals it doesn't really matter where it's extracted from if you can't process it, by the way. So a lot of the new material that's being sourced in China, in America and Australia, is still being processed in China. So kind of weird systems questions there. It led to Toyota, amongst others, really doubling down on fuel cells. Because why would you want to be beholden to rare earths that are in our battery materials? Well, we know where that went. And that's a really good illustration of when you think you can adjust your material inputs to deal with criticality, you'll often end up on the wrong direction of travel. And so where I come to with this incident as an example of how to tie together the other two slides is we need a little bit of what I might call critical realism. So above all, we need to have the data. If you are not understanding how much material, where and when, if you do not know the basic fundamentals, if you are not reading the documents from China and Japan and Ukraine and all the other places where they actually lay out their policies of the things they are doing, if you are not properly informed and then you do not understand the wrap around that, which might well be entirely storytelling, then you're in no position to certainly reduce mix dependence on criticality, and I think they're not in the best position to exploit it commercially either. Okay, geopolitics in 12.5 minutes. Not bad. I'm done.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I think everybody's woken up now, so thank you very much indeed for that, Mike. Now we've heard about the general talks about the regions. Now I'd like to move to the more specific. So I'd like to invite Munkubilek Namsrai, Director of Mineral Resources Research, Planning and Economics at the Mongolian National Geological Survey.
Hello, good morning, everyone. And I'll try to balance it with the very high motivated and speaker. I'll be balancing and trying to lower your heart rate. Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank to UK Embassy in Mongolia and organizers give us the opportunity to present the Mongolian potentials and critical minerals. So I would like to have a few words about our agency. Our agency is pretty newborn. I mean, re-established agency, got dependent in 2020 from the other authority, and now we are responsible for state-funded all the geological projects, and also we're the one who carries all geodata in our geodata system and our paper-based archives. All the geological data, meaning at the regional study research data, also we carry all the reports and feasibility studies in our archive. So I'd like to show these numbers to have you look at this number, Mongolia now, it's a dependent country on mineral sources. As you see in 2023 state revenue, 1/3 of the revenue was collected from the mineral source sector. That means our economy is now dependent on mineral sources. So the Mongolian government, they are trying to realize and be on a balance with the mineral sources activity. And so our parliament was approved the vision of 2050 and started the action plan of government from 2021. And now we're in the first period of our vision. So under this vision, the Mongolian government, they trying to bring these critical mineral research and the geological studies into action. And last few years, government funded few projects, especially for the critical minerals, and also we call that the strategic mineral and aka high tech rare minerals. So you can see some results from the state funded projects, but it's in the last reporting stage, and all the reports not public yet. I think from 2025 will be the public for the investors and for other stakeholders. So our other speakers were talking about the critical raw materials slot, and so this term is pretty new to us. We have our own version called strategic mineral resources, also strategic mineral deposits. So I would like to show these the very precise lists of critical minerals from 3 major countries and the regions. I believe there's 47 different mineral elements, actually. So from these 47 critical elements, we actually do have these in an active exporting and extracting. These orange colored elements are now in a stage of exploring and trying to build the resources based on our explorations. These dotted red elements, we have only occurrences found in state-funded geological studies, and we can call these green ones supporting economy minerals. These orange ones, we need the action and get the more investments to make mineral deposits more valuable and more proven. So these are the one now in the active exploring stage, and also need lots of investments. So now there left only 7 elements. It's not known yet in our territory, but we are trying to find those 7. But our geological position and geological history is not allowing yet. So I'd like to show some example maps of critical minerals. We now do have 6 rare earth element deposits and 26 promising occurrences throughout our country. And actually, we have 1.5 million square kilometer of territory. It's huge. And only we've been studied with the 1 to 50,000 geological mapping, only half of the country now. And we're planning next few years trying to study at least 20% more of the territory. But we're planning based on some scientific data to plan the the important areas. So we're planning for the next year develop 10 mapping projects with the 1 to 50,000 geological mapping. So
2 minutes left.
Okay. You can see that lithium deposits and occurrences locations. We only have 2 lithium deposits and 8 promising occurrences based on our geological study. But lately, that foreign invested companies, they're very actively exploring our eastern and western part to find the lithium deposits. So earlier the EITI speaker was mentioning the copper is one of the Mongolia's basic and main deposit, not only for the economy, but for the geological, how should I say, the geological formations. It's a very promising mineral source for Mongolia. So, National Geological Survey of Mongolia, we have collaboration with international organizations, and we're trying to activate these collaboration, make the goal to keep up with the criticality and trying to make our country as one of the potential country in the supply chain of critical mineral. So there's the list. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're going to have to move on. So you've only got 2 more speakers to wait until coffee and then ask the questions then. So I'd like to move on to Maxim Kononov, First Deputy Executive Director of the Association of Mining and Metallurgical Enterprises of Kazakhstan.
Thank you, David. Good morning, dear participants. It's a great pleasure for me to take part at this MINEX Eurasia conference here in London for the first time. And special thanks to organizers and Mr. Artur Polякov personally. Today, I would like to speak about current aspects of the development of the mining industry in Kazakhstan and also touch upon some issues related to situation with critical raw materials. But first of all, let me briefly introduce the organization I represent. It's called the Association of Mining and Metallurgical Enterprises of Kazakhstan, and we use abbreviation AGMP for it. AGMP was established back in 2005, so the next year we are going to celebrate our 20-year anniversary. AGMP is the largest industrial association in Kazakhstan, which comprises 95 enterprises of ferrous and non-ferrous metallurgy, gold mining, uranium, and coal industries. We are actively involved in the legislative process and work closely with the government and the parliament of Kazakhstan. AGMP is an authorized representative for the mining industry employers in the process of social partnership alongside with unions and the government. And it's also worth mentioning that AGMP is a member of the National Council of Stakeholders for EITI for more than 10 years, and we are members of the International Council on Mining and Metals, ICMM. So now let me shift to the topics of my presentation. Today I would like to cover the following aspects. The first one is taxation, then the mining legislation, including updates on digitalization of procedures, and the last topic is CRMs. So at the moment, the draft of the new tax code is under consideration in the lower house of Kazakhstan parliament, and its certain provisions related to mining industry appear very promising to us. In particular, those are the amendments related to exploration expenses. So from now on, both successful and unsuccessful exploration expenses will be allowed for deductions when calculating corporate income tax. It can be done within mining license or against other income from commercial activities, since we have separate tax accounting for miners. Then the amendments related to the mineral extraction tax, which will be lowered by 90% for metals extracted from so-called technogenic mineral formations, which are mining and metallurgy wastes, including tailings, overburden, etc. And that could be very interesting in context of CRMs. I will tell about it later. And also we have the amendments aimed to boost processing of minerals in Kazakhstan. The new tax code contains certain tax incentives or tax exemptions as part of processing agreements, which can be signed between the government and a mining company. It is important to mention that transition from mineral extraction tax to royalty in Kazakhstan is still under discussion. But I can tell that more likely royalty model will be available to newcomers only, for new companies who are coming to Kazakhstan. And that may happen starting from year 2026. The next slide. Some information about mining legislation. The mining legislation reform started in Kazakhstan in 2017, and it's still on its way. The latest updates to the subsoil use code, which are being discussed at the moment, include revising the procedure for forming the subsoil management program. So now auctions for exploration right will be held for deposits with approved reserves, as well as for areas with multiple applicants. In all other cases, the first come, first served principle will be fully applied. The second one is that we have amendments related to functioning of newly established National Geological Survey and Unified Subsoil Use Platform, which I will describe later. Just a few words about the National Geological Survey. You can see their logo below on the right. It is established as a national operator for collection, storage, processing, and provision of geological information. So something similar to Mongolian example. I can say that this model looks like something more familiar to international investors in terms of types of services it provides and the role actually this structure performs in the mining industry. And of course, you can find some more detailed information about it on their website, which is geology.kz. Last for this slide, but definitely not the least, is are changes that are related to opening up the entire territory of Kazakhstan for exploration. Actually, this used to be a key pillar of the legislative reform, and now we can say that it is starting to take a real shape. So the next slide is about unified subsoil use platform, which was launched in pilot mode on November 1st, a month ago. The platform is intended to implement all business processes related to mining operations and automate them within a single space. As long as I know, the developers of this platform studied analogs from different countries, including Norway, Brazil, Peru, Canada, India, and more specifically Finland. The platform has the following features. First one is interactive map, indicating areas for exploration or extraction, including those with approved reserves. The second one is module for collecting, recording, storing, and ensuring accessibility of geological information, including geologic reports. Module for automation of public services, including conducting auctions and reporting in the field of subsoil use and geology. And some other services include database for existing subsoil use contracts and licenses, and analytics dashboard. Here are some screenshots from this platform, and you can also find out more about it by visiting the website. So my last slide with update on critical raw materials. Some quick facts. 124 cerium deposits have been identified in Kazakhstan, including deposits containing vanadium, titanium, zirconium, tantalum, niobium, lithium, molybdenum, tungsten, beryllium, rare earths. And 11 more areas are being explored for ceriums right now. Kazakhstan already produces beryllium, tantalum, niobium, titanium, magnesium, zirconium, ammonium perrhenate with content of uranium about 70%, black selenium, bismuth, copper telluride, scandium, and gallium. Although it's, I have to say that the production of gallium is suspended right now in Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan doesn't produce it, but it used to. And by the way, the technogenic mineral formations or mine wastes are considered to be an important source of CRMs in Kazakhstan, since ores of most deposits are complex and usually only base metals were extracted during production. So everything else is left within these technogenic wastes. So now, but potential of mine waste is being actively explored in Kazakhstan. In December 2023, Kazakhstan adopted comprehensive development plan for rare and rare earth metals with some certain measures aimed at enhancing competitiveness of the industry. By the way, now we are starting to draft a concept for medium-term development of the mining and metallurgical industry in a broader sense, not only for CRMs, but for every other metals. This initiative has already received support from the Prime Minister. So hopefully we'll be able to present it maybe at the next MINEX forum, and I can keep just my fingers crossed here. So we really hope for that we will have that concept. Okay, so coming back to CRMs, Kazakhstan recently signed memorandums of cooperation in this field with the UK, the USA, the EU, and the Republic of Korea. By 2025, Kazakhstan is planning to remove state secrecy of critical mineral assets. For instance, this was already done for lithium reserves in 2021. Another step Kazakhstan is going to take is development of specific national standards for rare minerals. and providing legal definition of CRMs in the subsoil use code for more specific regulation on them. So that's it for me, from my side. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Getting close to the coffee, so hold your questions for Maxime for the coffee break. Our last speaker, Ruslan Bamishev, is joining us online.
Good morning, dear participants of the MINEX conference. Unfortunately, I was able to attend in person today. Just today, we held a high-level meeting of industry leaders with government authorities, heads of diplomatic missions of investor countries, where we discussed the prospect for the development of the mining sector in Kazakhstan. Let me share the vision of the Kazakhstan Chamber of Mines of the current investment climate of the mining sector in Kazakhstan, trends and challenges that the industry facing today. The President of Republic of Kazakhstan has repeatedly made it clear that the issue of attracting investment in the country is a key task of the government. At the same time, there is an understanding that manual management without creating the necessary environment will not give the necessary effect. The Chamber of Mines represents the interests of foreign and domestic investors working in the mining sector, mainly in geological exploration in Kazakhstan. To date, we united almost 50 companies. The shares of number of investors are listed on stock exchanges in UK, USA, Canada, Australia, and others. Therefore, central factors, initiatives, and challenges in current legislation, etc., are assessed by an independent market and affect both the value of shares of companies implementing projects in Kazakhstan and the almost of investment sent to the country. First of all, I would like to know that the members of the chamber appreciate the industry reforms that have made the MMC industry one of the most attractive country jurisdiction. Thanks to this, world leaders with their early stage exploration experience, such as Rio Tinto, Fortescue, First Quantum, Tech, B2Gold, and others, came to Kazakhstan. As President Tokayev noted that at the Foreign Investor Council, investment in exploration in the 5 years after the adoption of the code exceeded $1 billion, increasing threefold. Annual investment in high-risk exploration amounted to more than $200 million. Only members of the chamber explore more than 25,000 square kilometers now, have social obligations and other. Why they do not earn in the Republic Kazakhstan on production? These are the prospects of for the medium and long terms, taking into account further investments. For an objective assessment, speaking of positive aspects, it is necessary to note the challenges faced by the industry. There is a primary issues related to the stability of industry and tax laws. Also, the predictability of such reforms. As examples, the following problems can be cited as well as opportunities in this context. First of all, it's a tax policy. The issue of increasing the tax burden is objectively very sensitive for investors. That is why the president has postponed the adoption of new tax code for the second time. We are in dialogue with the government and expect the balanced and fair burden. As an example from economic theory, the Laffer curve was cited, which if explained in its simplified terms shows that low taxes rates in practice increase the volume of tax revenues and vice versa. That is, high taxes can minimize the state's revenues. That is also why for so-called new licenses, which have not yet created a new taxable base for the future, we propose to consider the introduction for the royalty mechanism, which is clear and accepted particularly all over the world. Discussing the issues of tax reform, we see opportunities to determine a fair and balanced tax burden, as well as an important step towards in the introduction of a conceptually new royalty regime. As noted by previous speakers, there are already a number of positive developments for the industry. The new code is being discussed in Parliament, and we hope that its adoption will provide additional initiatives for the investors. The second, it's initiatives to amend the code on subsoil and subsoil use. Today, we are involved in a heated debate in the lower house of the Parliament of Kazakhstan related to proposal to amend the sectoral law. We welcome democratic principles and transparency of the lawmaking process. At the same time, the essence of today's challenges come down to conceptual attempts to return to the previous system and its principles. Thanks to visits of the Minister of Industry, Mr. Sharlapayev, to our office, as well as quarterly open dialogue with him, we are able to show the world experience and practice, on the basis of which the curricular decisions and adjusted. We fundamentally stand in favor of preserving the conceptual foundations of the reform and promote steps to improve the investment climate. The Chamber is already working on a package of amendments to the subsoil code aimed at improving sector regulation. Third, it's industrial policy. This year alone, we have repeatedly discussed with the government the issues of ensuring the implementation of industrial policy. It should be noted that in a short period of the time, the government was able to achieve the results in increasing the level of industrial policy. And such task will be faced by all investors. We understand and accept the state goals and objectives, but the concern of international investors are related to ambiguity of the application of such novelties and the possibility of changing them at any moment. We see the difficulties that separate norms aimed at the implementation of industrial policy bring to the industry. The answers to many questions can be provided by the industrial strategy. This work is now beginning carried out by the Chamber in cooperation with Atomican. The next, it's a local content and support of domestic producers. The Chamber's favors the development of the local market as it allows for the more responsive and competitive solutions to problems in the region. At the same time, we are in favor of more incentive-based principles as opposed to punitive ones. Earlier, we state that in the world, the producement process of subsoil users is not regulated by the state as it prohibited in Kazakhstan, which with the adoption of the new subsoil code, geological exploration was exempted from the producers, and this has worked positively for the investment climate in general. Today, there are proposals to adopt the world practice when business itself regulate the relations between MMCs and DSPs, and we believe that there is still great potential for clearing and fair platform. It's difficult in the implementation or projects on the ground. It should be noted that Kazakhstan has developed a positive practice in negotiations with local residents. At public environment hearings, social support and environmental protection may ensure adequate to the investment demanded. Akimats also often help to find a balance, as elsewhere in the world, difficult remain in negotiation with land users when the investor is left alone with the landowner. The Chamber, in cooperation with the sectoral ministry, is now looking for a win-win solution. This work is not limited to land user issues. It also covers environmental issues, water use, and etc. Today, dialogue and examples are not given to investors to negative view of Kazakhstan investment attractiveness. No geological potential, colossal amount of historical data, legal basics of work understandable to whole world in Kazakhstan keeps it leader in terms of investment attractiveness of geological exploration in the world. Similar problem, perhaps even more significant, inherent in many other jurisdictions. We realize there are issues in our country so that there is a common desire of the state and business to solve them. Today, there is outgoing development dialogue on resolving this issue. In closing, I wanted to thank everyone to their attention and emphasize that the Chamber is open to all stakeholders to ensure constructive dialogues. Thank you, colleagues. I wish you luck in your conference.
Thank you very much, Ruslan. Is there any questions? Obviously, Ruslan, you can't catch up with in the coffee break. Any questions for Ruslan? In which case, then I think it's time for a cuppa.